I was a prosecutor in Oakland when the Oscar Grant murder occurred, and we have not made progress in this country as it relates to Black men being killed by the police since that. And so, our letter to the Department of Justice certainly is looking at the oversight of prosecutors, making the decisions, in the Georgia case. I mean, that's one discrete case, but it really is just asking broadly, how is prosecutorial discretion being used when you have, white police officers or the criminal justice system failing to hold accountable people who are, killing Black men for what looks like to be racially motivated reasons.
Eric Swalwell, a congressman from California, who also sits on the Judiciary Committee. And you will remember he was a candidate for president in the 2020 primaries. So Congressman Swalwell, welcome to the show.
Of course, thanks for having me on, Jamal.
When we first decided to have this conversation, we were going to talk a little bit more broadly about politics, and we can get into a little bit of that. But obviously the world has literally caught fire in the last day or two. We saw what happened in Minneapolis last night. It's literally on fire. We have people in the streets. The tensions are very high. You're on the House Judiciary Committee, and you guys are thinking about how to get the Department of Justice to engage on some of these questions. What's going on at DOJ?
Jamal, the real question, I think, if you're a Black man in America, is what has really changed over the last few decades? What has really changed in America positively in the criminal justice system to make Black men safer? And so many of my peers who have young children tell me about this conversation they have to have with their young boys about interacting with the police and being careful not to make sudden movements or not to drive at certain times because they want their kids to come home. And that's awful. But you would expect that as we find progress in most parts of our lives in education and healthcare and innovation, we could find progress in our country in this area, and we just have not. As you pointed out in Georgia with Arbery, it was not a police officer, but there were certainly ties to the police department and the district attorney's office by the individuals accused of killing Mr. Arbery. And
you guys are looking at systemic police misconduct also, which is a type of investigation that the Trump administration already kind of put the kibosh on earlier in the administration. So you asked them to get that started again?
Yes, and I'm the son of a police officer. As I mentioned, I was a prosecutor in Oakland, and I have two brothers who are police officers right now. And what I have found is that departments that invest in training, particularly in de-escalation, departments that recognize that there is a racial bias that exists and try and train officers, to recognize that and address that, and also to have police officers who look like the communities that they patrol. Diversifying the police force can all go a long way to reduce police killings. When I ran for president, I still believe this should be the case, but I had promised that I would tie cops funding to whether departments had in place, de-escalation policies, whether they had diverse police forces that looked like the communities that they patrolled. I think you should condition federal funding on factors like that, and that can go a long way to reducing killings like we saw with Mr. Floyd.
So, Congressman, I got to ask you, do you trust the Trump administration to investigate police misconduct and prosecutorial misconduct in America?
No, and when the president, weighed in on the George Floyd case, I cringed because it seems like, he's calling for, Trump justice, which people don't want Trump justice, which is basically, no investigation. It's just kind of, he puts his finger up on the political winds and he recognizes that people are outraged and he just wants to say, well, let's get justice for, George Floyd, and doesn't understand the underlying issues that are really at stake here. But Mr. Floyd's death is not a political weapon. It's not something to, it's not supposed to be an opportunity for the president. There's going to be more George Floyds in America, and we don't want that to be the case. So understand, what has caused his death and why people are frustrated that he may not, his family may not have justice. So I'm afraid the president doesn't understand why people are outraged about this. It's not just that, an innocent black man did not go home to his family. It's that this is going to happen again, and we've learned nothing from the cases that have happened before.
So you're on the Judiciary Committee. I'm old enough to remember 1991 when this happened, and there were riots in Los Angeles after the Rodney King verdict. What seems to be true, though, is that when there's a black victim, there is a reluctance on behalf of juries or maybe prosecutors to either bring the case or argue the case effectively to get not just a charge, but actually some sort of a judgment against officers. How do we fix that?
And I saw that firsthand in Alameda County. We prosecuted for murder in the Oscar Grant case, and it was tough. The district attorney who made that call knew that doing so was going to create tension with the police, and ultimately did the right thing by deciding to prosecute. Now, the jury did not come back with a murder verdict. They came back with a reduced liability verdict, that it was essentially, I believe it was negligent homicide was the theory of the case. But we did seek, a murder conviction there. But too often, as you pointed out, that is not the case. And, I believe in cases like this, it's also important, if there is a question about neutrality or a question about being independent, then there needs to be a system in place in states where outside prosecutors can make the decision, because too often you'll see that the commingling between the police department and the district attorney's office makes it very difficult for the district attorney's office to make a decision like this. I frankly think that anytime there's an officer involved killing, that it's better if you kind of had a statewide pool of district attorneys. So, for example, if in San Francisco, an officer kills a white, black, Hispanic, individual, that it's not the San Francisco district attorney's office that evaluates the case, that it's drawn out of a pool and another office in the state looks at it. Because I can just tell you, as a prosecutor who worked with police officers, it's natural, it's human bonds of friendship and trust are formed, and sometimes that can color the ability to make an impartial decision. And so I think having policies in place that get rid of that and just look at the evidence really is what's needed.
I gotta tell you, as I look at this, and this is 2020, you think, what's different between 2020 and 1920? 2020 and 1820, 1720. It's almost like as long as we've had, black people in the United States, we've had this problem of the law enforcement system exerting maximum force to control.
And Jamal, can I say something else? Someone said something to me yesterday, and I think they were saying it with a lot of empathy for Mr. Floyd's family, but and I bet most of your viewers have heard this in some form, which is, it was wrong what happened to Mr. Floyd, but why do, they have to go out and riot? It just takes away from, what has happened. And at first you're like, okay, maybe there's a point there. And then you step back and realize that, that be careful of who you think they are. Because I remember in Oakland, in many cases, the people who were arrested for breaking into properties or starting fires were not connected at all to the movement, for Oscar Grant. And it's early right now, and we'll determine who, is responsible for some of these fires and, the windows that are broken. But it looks like there are individuals who aren't even associated with, Justice for George Floyd, who are, for their own reasons, causing their own mayhem and havoc. They're anti-government individuals. They like to stoke these situations come in. And so I think you just have to be careful to say they and project, all of that onto people who want justice for George Floyd.
Yeah. You mentioned something a minute ago I want to talk about really quickly. You mentioned the president and his weighing in on this, and we saw him say something that was pretty inflammatory today. Twitter then pushes back and is they for the first time are putting explainers on Donald Trump's tweets. But they say that he violated their policy against violence today, promotion of violence today. What do you think about how Twitter interacts with political officials, and where's the line between how this private company should, I guess, police speech?
Yeah, I mean, it was, you've come to really expect anything when you wake up in the morning and look at the president's tweets, but to see essentially like a blurred image over the tweet was something I never thought I'd see. And then when I read the tweet, you shake your head and say, is this really the president of the United States saying that if you're looting, there will be shooting, and knowing that there is a historical context to that? He's not just, cleverly, using rhymes. That has been said in the past, to intimidate, Black protesters. And so he knew what he was doing by saying that. I think he put Twitter in a position where they can't allow someone with the largest platform in the world to stoke or incite violence. And for anyone who says it's censorship would have been if they had taken it down, which I think you could make an argument that it should have been taken down, but they didn't take it down on their own private platform, by the way. This isn't the public square. They didn't take it down. They just put a, kind of a warning over it. And by the way, Jamal, even stepping back, in the public square, you cannot yell fire, right? You couldn't go into a crowded protest and claim there's a fire and cause a stampede. So I don't think the president really has much of an informed understanding as to what free speech is. I do think Twitter has a responsibility to not see further inciting of violence.
And is your understanding, Lynn, to thinking that his executive order has any merit at all? Will it have any impact?
No, and what's so interesting is he is someone who has blocked hundreds of people on Twitter, right? So he's okay, being an arbiter of, speech that's allowed and not allowed. He is in the courts, I think in Michigan, trying to sue an organization that's Priorities USA that's running an ad against him, saying that he doesn't like the ad. So again, when it comes to Donald Trump, it's just always about Donald Trump. There's no consistent philosophy, as it relates to the Constitution. It's really just what helps Donald Trump.
That seems to be very much true. And I know, you ran for president. You spent a lot of time traveling around the country and meeting and talking to people. I've been on presidential campaigns, and what I found, I got to tell you, being a young Black man in America, growing up in Detroit, experiencing a lot of the adversity that we're now seeing the result of, I found being involved in politics did a different thing for me. It actually made me more hopeful about the country, because you got to see people and the commonalities between people, and maybe a little bit more about like their best foot forward, not just their worst. I don't know what you found when you were on that trail. I know you got a book coming out, so maybe this is going to be in that book.
Yeah, I have a book coming out called Endgame, Inside the Impeachment of President Trump. And what I found on the trail was how seriously, people who show up at events to vet candidates take this. It's like a second job in the early states for an Iowan or a Granite Stater or someone from South Carolina. They take the responsibility of picking a president very seriously. And Jamal, they share with you things that they probably only tell their spouse. I mean, the number of times as you're leaving a living room or walking out of a brew pub and someone pulls you aside and says, I need your help on this. And they're talking about a family member who has a mental health issue or their own personal medical condition. You really see that they put their trust and their faith in candidates, and you don't want to let them down. But you can't help but walk away optimistic that this country, even in these times, will sustain itself. We're resilient and we're optimistic, I think, at our core, and we'll come out of this.